The Zone Coverage Podcast Network.
They may be drinkers, Robin, but they're also human beings.
Hell yeah, let's get stinko.
Giles and the Goalie Podcast. I am your host, Giles Farrell. Across the computer for me is Ben Remington.
Hello.
And this is the 150th episode of the Giles and the Goalie Podcast. And
it's exciting.
Yeah, I don't think we saw 150 episodes in our future when we started this otherwise fine production. In the bowels of Patrick McGovern's bar.
Yeah, I don't know that we saw 150 coming later in that year as well when we were losing every other podcast that we recorded.
Yeah, I think we were going to have I think we thought we were going to have a short-lived podcast life, but we hung through it and now we're here. We celebrate 150 episodes of the Giles and the Goalie podcast under less than ideal circumstances, as the big news of today that called the emergency recording of the podcast was Chuck Fletcher will not be retained as Minnesota Wild general manager. Craig Leopold making the announcement and meeting with the media shortly after noon here Monday afternoon. Ben, overall thoughts on the announcement? We let it all out there on the most recent podcast, which had a shelf life of 14 hours. That might have been the shortest span of a podcast shelf life.
We're reaching Nate Wells territory here.
Yeah. But no, I mean, what were your initial thoughts when you jumped off the airplane today and you saw Chuck Fletcher was not coming back?
Well, I think it. We said a lot of what was said on the podcast. That was released this morning or recorded yesterday, whatever. And I think that Craig Leopold's statement was a very classy way of saying what we said as well. And not that we were classless about it, but it's very classy by him to basically say, yeah, you know what? Chuck did a good job for us and I'm forever grateful, but, we need new eyes and we need a new direction. And he's absolutely right. And that's exactly what we said yesterday. So, it feels good sometimes when, you and I, are just kind of yammering our opinions over a couple of beers, and then the owner of the Wild basically echoes those statements the next day. So, always good.
Noted listener of the Giles and the Goalie podcast, Craig Leopold. Michael Russo wrote about confidants being in Leopold's ear over the last couple weeks. So maybe the quote-unquote confidants are the Giles and the Goalie podcast.
Well, I'm angling myself for the GM position, so we'll see how well that works out.
Yeah, you launched your campaign today, Rem for GM.
Yep.
So there you go.
Good luck.
You know what's funny is after we recorded Sunday afternoon and I was driving home and it's not a long car ride home from where we record to where I live, and
right.
But in that short time, I started to kind of talk myself into the fact that Chuck Fletcher was probably going to get retained.
Oh,
which
wow. Okay.
I had said the complete opposite on the podcast yesterday, where I was like, yeah, it's time to go, and But then on the way home, it's like, well, usually when I think one thing, the opposite happens. So I started kind of believing that he was going to come back, and so there was a little bit of shock for me today when I saw the announcement, or Russo broke the story, and then 2 minutes later the team announced it, which is usually the status quo. Russo will break something, then 2 minutes later the team goes, "Oh, look, here it is." I'm always oddly fascinated by it. I always wonder if, like, just inside they're just like, crap, Russo scooped us again.
Well, they had to take the 2 minutes to make the graphic, so.
Yeah, there you go. But the also weird thing is, like, usually when there's a GM being let go, like, the national guys get some wind of that, but there was no national guy tweeting about it. Russo was the only one who had that, and then the team announced it.
Well, he's a national guy. He's jet setting off to Vegas to cover the second round.
And so anyway, I sidebarred way too hard there. We put it all out there yesterday, and so, like I said, I guess maybe I was done, but there was a shock a little bit for me. But when Craig Leopold, a pretty patient guy in his own right, says that it's time for fresh eyes on this team, then you must know that he's kind of at a point where he's pretty desperate, I guess. And also, like I said yesterday, this team is at an extreme crossroads, and I think this speaks to the fact that he really wanted somebody else to come in and guide them through this crossroads rather than the guy he's had for 9 years. And so I guess that kind of shows maybe the confidence level he had in Chuck Fletcher. But I don't know. I think you're going to hammer this point home, but as I tried to convey, Chuck Fletcher did a pretty difficult thing with this team where he inherited a team that had nothing, no prospects, very little high-end talent, and basically was said, here, you need to craft a consistent playoff team. It took him a few years, but he did so, and the Wild have made the playoffs 6 straight years, and this is like the third, I think it's tied for second for longest active streak in the National Hockey League with Anaheim, and they only trail Pittsburgh, who's at 12.
Right.
The Blackhawks do not have a streak like that. The Capitals do not have a streak like that. The Sharks, like, you list off any team who has been really good over the last, decade, and the Wild have the second longest playoff streak in the NHL. So that's not an easy thing to do, but when you make the playoffs 6 years in a row and your average win total in those playoffs is 2 games, it's probably time for a fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what we said yesterday, and I think that, it'll be interesting now, and we talked about this too, but it'll be interesting now to see what direction this team could possibly go because, Leopold flat out said today that this is not a rebuild. He expects this team to, compete for a cup, but understands also that could take a couple of years. I mean, this team isn't going to be a Stanley Cup contending team next year, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be a rebuild going on. And I think that some people were oddly confused by that. But I think that's absolutely accurate. And I think that the most important thing with Fletcher's firing is, even though there was so much vitriol for that guy, it's not going to be any easier on the next guy either. And so the next guy is going to have to do everything just right in order to even have a chance at building, a team that's markedly better than the team right now. And there's going to be a lot of risk involved there. I mean, you can't deal the Ninos, the Coyles, the Zuckers of the world without any risk. So I think it's, a lot of people are, celebrating this as like the Wild are now suddenly going to be a cup contender next season. And it's just like, it's not going to be that easy.
Leopold said he was looking to still win the Stanley Cup in the next 3 to 4 years, and I just don't know if that's the window. I think the window's much shorter than that for this team, and I think it's only at 1 to 2 years, if I'm being honest. And
Right.
As much as I like to look at the glass half full kind of a approach, I got to imagine he's looking to hire somebody who's going to come out guns blazing and hopefully push the right button here in that 1 to 2 year window, because I just don't think there's a 3 to 4 year window when you got Parise and Suter signed for another 8 years, and
Yeah.
You're going to start looking at locking up other guys of this core long term. I think you have a very narrow window to win here, and I think that plays into hiring somebody like Paul Fenton of Nashville, who has seen the Wild many, many times over the last few years, to kind of help them have an idea of what they would like to do. But there's a very small window for this team to win now, and the last couple of failing postseasons have really not helped. And now as we kind of look at the next GM, like I said, you really got to hope that they can push the right buttons and call the right shots, because otherwise that GM is probably going to be constructing a rebuild within the next half decade. So,
well, that's just it. I mean, I don't know. I don't have quite the bleak outlook for this team's window, because I think that there's enough young players here. There's enough under 30 guys that even with an aging Parise and Suter, I think that there might have a little more years involved there. But to your point, yeah, it's going to be very hard for anyone to turn this team around, and anyone to turn this team around quickly. Like I did an article for Wild Extra years back that I'd love to resurrect, but it was, here is every Stanley Cup winner since I think I went back to, 1990, 1995 or something like that. They all had a homegrown Hall of Famer on their team. And I think that's very important. We talked about this going into the Jets series, where stars win in the playoffs. And this new GM, essentially, his assignment is, well, go out and find us a star, because the ones that we have aren't good enough. And so where are you going to dig up Sidney Crosby, Jonathan Taves, Anze Kopitar, that type of player like that? That's going to be incredibly difficult, and that's probably what it takes to win.
So, like, when you say star, you're talking like a John Tavares?
That name was brought up by a friend of the show, Brett Marshall, this weekend, and I'm not saying that John Tavares wouldn't help this team. He absolutely would, but I just don't see a scenario where that goes the Wild's way. Like, if you're him, why on earth would you want to come here versus other opportunities that probably have more cap room, like everyone? And also, they kind of got into this mess by handing out some long-term lucrative contracts, which is, it's going to take a max deal to get Tavares. So, not that I'm against it, because obviously he's very good, but I just don't see a scenario where that's happening.
I forget who has been saying this. Just as I listen to too many hockey podcasts, so sometimes I get things confused. But somebody has been saying that at some point a player is going to go into free agency, a big marquee player, and they're just going to take like a 1, maybe 2-year deal to try to win and go somewhere, and then still cash in free agency at the end of that deal. Which,
Yeah.
not a bad idea, but you don't know who that is. Maybe John Tavares does that. I don't know. Anyway, we're not here to tell you about John Tavares. We got horribly sidetracked.
That's a free agency podcast.
Yeah, we've got plenty of off-season shows to fill.
Right.
Did you have any other things that kind of stuck out to you from the Leopold presser or the player clean-out day?
No, I didn't. I haven't been able to absorb much of it, being pretty busy out here on the West Coast. But I was honestly a little surprised by how quickly that it was announced that Fletcher wouldn't come back. I thought that that Leopold would mull it for a little bit longer, but I think after seeing Game 5. I certainly think it was the correct move, and it would have been the correct move had he waited a week to do it. But I think there was some vitriol there. I think there was a little bit of emotion in how quickly it was decided, because usually these things take forever. And I know both of us were fully anticipating it taking days, even possibly weeks, for them to decide Fletcher's future, but. That was the thing that was surprising to me. I mean, even with knowing that they would have a meeting today and all that jazz, I was still a little surprised that he pulled the trigger that quickly.
I kind of figured that if he was going to do it, it was going to be done quick.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to kind of let this play out into the offseason. You want to get the ball rolling and get on with it so you can give the new GM the most amount of time to prepare for the offseason. But if I thought it was going to go longer into the offseason, that played more into Chuck Fletcher returning.
Sure.
So that wasn't overly a big surprise to me that, when he did it, it was done really quick. But the only other thing that jumped out at me was Matt Dembeck met with the media today, and everyone else kind of just said, they're sad, and it's a business, and we have to be better, and blah blah blah. But Matt Dembeck just kind of came out, and he just said straight up he was shocked that this is the direction they went, and I just don't know if that was the feeling entirely in the room or what, because usually when you get a locker room clean-out day, you get one player who kind of says something that goes against the grain, against what the rest of the team has said, and nobody really said they were shocked except Matt Dumba, so I was just taken a little bit aback by that, and I don't know. I guess if you don't
nativity there,
I guess if you don't see that, jobs are on the line, then maybe that was just kind of a motivational factor. You have to know that jobs are almost always on the line in this industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Dumb has obviously never been through it before. He was drafted by Fletcher. And, I think that he just kind of relied on the safety of Fletcher. But, yeah, I don't know. That is truly baffling. If he honestly didn't think it was a possibility. I think what was a Coyle after Game 5 that mentioned something about, basically hoping that the GM would make some moves for us and that kind of thing. I don't know how you don't see that coming after, the results that they've had.
I don't know. That just kind of struck me as weird, and the only other thing I really gave a hoot about from cleanout day was Devin Dubnyk wearing a Barstool hat, which drove me up the tree. Somebody get him a new hat.
A lot of the players, this may surprise you, Giles, but a lot of the players don't see things the way that us fans see things. So I think sometimes they might be more, a little more crude sometimes, like the folks at Barstool.
Yeah,
There's a lot of people that are really, really big fans of that site, and I don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan myself, but I understand the appeal, I guess I could say.
Yeah, there are many good hats out there. That is not one of them. Now, as we kind of look ahead to the new general manager, what are you looking for in now the third GM in Wild history?
Well, it's tough because it's really hard to find somebody with a track record of doing a lot of things good that's available. So it's not going to be like, oh, it's going to be super easy to, find a guy who has won Stanley Cups and has made a lot of great trades and has not made a lot of bad trades and stuff like that. So the track record is really usually hard to kind of measure on. I mean, George McPhee's track record wasn't really, sparkling. I guess if you just look at the Philip Forsberg trade, but he seems to be doing pretty well for himself. And then also, look at the previous failures of other, GMs that end up, pretty good teams. So I don't know. I think it's obviously going to be an NHL guy. It's obviously going to be a guy who is an assistant GM or that kind of position with a team right now. I would look for someone who has been, with winning organizations, someone who has, been with organizations that have won by unearthing, prospects or unearthing players, diamonds in the rough, that kind of thing. I look for that. I mean, I really like the hire of the Twins in Falvey and Levine because, those were two guys who, Falvey came from the Indians where they made their name on unearthing no-name pitchers and turning them into Cy Young winners. And same thing with Levine, who did, a good job in Texas of getting the most out of their pitching staff and even, some of their prospects there. Looking for a hire like that where, guys have been somewhere and they've been instrumental in, turning nothing into something.
I guess I kind of mentioned already what I'm looking for in a general manager, with basically coming out guns blazing and hopefully pushing the right buttons, making the right trades to get this team over the hump. But something else I'm looking for is hopefully next GM will kind of make amends with Kirill Kaprizov and hopefully iron out that situation and get him over here when his deal is up in 2 years. Because ultimately he could be the key to keeping the Wild's window to win open.
Yeah, I mean, I talked
set.
about that homegrown star, and that's the guy. And so that really might be item number one on the checklist.
And then obviously Jason Zucker, Matt Dumba, two very key players in the Minnesota Wild machine, are RFAs this summer, and kind of figuring out their status will be top of the list. But And then just hang on to draft picks. And I threw this out there on Zone Coverage today, and tomorrow I write, what Chuck Fletcher did well. And, when Chuck Fletcher did actually use his draft picks, he actually did a pretty good job, and that's more credit to his second in command, Brent Flair. But, the Wild actually did make the most of their draft picks when they had them, or their higher draft picks, I should say. And not having those high draft picks in the last 4 years has really kind of hurt this team, and it's really put even more pressure on guys like Joel Eriksson Ek, Jordan Greenway, and Luke Cunnin, who had up and down years, and Luke Cunnin now is hurt, and so hopefully developing those guys will be key for the next GM, and drafting more potential, star players will be on the list for me too.
Yeah, and everyone's quick to criticize Fletcher's draft. Oh, he passed on Brock Besser. Well, that's nice, but everyone passed on Brock Besser. I mean, we can't act like just because Besser's a hometown kid, we can't act like it was only Chuck Fletcher's faux pas, like he went against the grain of conventional scouting to pass on Brock Besser. You know what I mean? Like we did, scouting for that draft, and we wrote about Brock Besser, and he had strengths and weaknesses, and there was pros and cons to his game that you obviously see at the time. But it baffles me when people act like Fletcher was the only GM that could have drafted Brock Besser. You mean you want to be upset about it? I guess that's fine, but don't pretend like that it was either Besser or Eriksson Ek, and those were his only two options.
Yeah, the more drafts I cover and follow it, the more you just realize past like the number 3 pick in the draft every year, you are literally just taking lottery picks.
Yeah.
Like, no matter what they tell you, there's no scientific method to the NHL draft. You are picking the player based on, a scout's recommendations, and you hope that scout is right. And then once you pick said player, it's on developing that player. And there's a lot that goes into, drafting a player and turning them into an NHL star like Brock Besser. And as you said,
right.
A lot of teams passed on Brock Besser because, one way or another, they didn't think that highly of him. And had it not been for an injury, he probably is the Rookie of the Year. So,
yeah.
There you go. That's why you just hang on to your draft picks, because you're just increasing your odds of winning the lottery.
Yep.
So that's all I'm really looking for in a GM. And obviously I'll probably think of more, but that's when we can podcast more. We've got plenty of podcasts this offseason to cover. So that can probably wrap it up for this emergency edition of the podcast. You got any final thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I think it's really easy to look back, negatively on Fletcher's time, and not that you even have to look back positively, but I think you sent out a tweet today that gained some traction.
Can we not?
Twitter.
Let's not.
And I think the point is to try to be fair, and the articles that you were putting out this week are just that. Chuck Fletcher had some failures here, and he also had some successes. And so I think it's, I think looking back and just seeing only the negatives with Chuck Fletcher and acting like a new GM is going to do no wrong is just setting yourself up for massive failure as a fan. Having those kind of expectations that, oh, well, now that Fletcher's gone, this team's going to be great. And I think there are some people that honestly think that. And it kind of comes with the amount of disdain that Fletcher had with some fans here. And it's silly, and those people are just not going to, they're not setting themselves up well.
Boy. Well, final thought is not really Wild related because I've gotten out a lot of Wild thoughts here in the last 2 days, but congratulations to you. You win the weekly wager. I now get to shovel some coleslaw and mushrooms down the old gullet at the next time we convene for this podcast. It'll be a couple weeks because you are out of town. At the Caps and Penguins will meet in the second round, and boy, I got to tell you, I am excited to get hurt again.
What if this time they pull it off and then lose in the conference semifinals or the semifinals?
No, that's how they get you.
Yeah.
I'll leave with this.
It's entirely possible they beat the Penguins and then lose in terrible fashion to either the Bruins or the Lightning.
I'll leave it with this on the other series, on the only series that's going to Game 7. What if I told you this time the Bruins blow a 3-1 lead?
It's interesting. The Bruins were red hot going into the postseason, so it's a little surprising to me. They were my pick, and but Toronto's good. Credit where credit's due. Frederik Andersen is playing well, and Tuukka Rask not as much. So
yeah. All right, that can wrap it up for us. Follow Ben and I on Twitter at Ben Remington, at Giles Farrell. We will be writing this week at zonecoverage.com. Check that out. Follow us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, wherever. If you do follow on iTunes, drop us a rating, subscribe. It helps boost the show. And with that, unless any other major news happens, we will be back on Sunday with another recording of the Giles and Goy podcast.
Yes, sir.
So we will catch you then.
Later.
It's not resiliency. You're making it sound like we're good. That's all. I'm done.